Russians themselves have always been suspicious of Asian migration into the Russian Far East, and I think they still are. We see many Chinese going to that area. But at the same time, I think that Xi feels he's ideologically aligned with Putin.
Now, the history of modern China, told through the story of one family, the author's own. Edward Wong is a diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times and formerly their Beijing bureau chief. And his new book is a personal account of a century of momentous change in China. At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China is out now. Edward Wong, welcome to the studio.
Thanks a lot, Hugo.
Great to have you here. Look, your father's story links in to the big movements in 20th century China. As we get started, just sketch out for us the sort of the key movements, the key events in your father's life and how it relates to the development of China.
Sure. He was born in Hong Kong to a merchant family there, merchant Chinese family, and he had to leave Hong Kong. He had to flee with his older brother and other family members when the Japanese invaded in 1941 and occupied Hong Kong. So then he grew up in southern China, went to high school in Guangzhou, formerly known as Canton, and that was during the Chinese Civil War when the nationalists and the communists were fighting. So when he graduated from high school, he became enamored of Mao's revolution. Mao had just won the Civil War. The nationalists had fled. And he thought that he could sign on to Mao's project for China. He went north to Beijing for university, and instead of staying in university, he decided to join the military, the People's Liberation Army, in order to first fight the Americans on the Korean Peninsula because he believed that the Americans would try and invade China if they won in Korea. And then later on, he was sent with the army out to far northwest China on the Central Asian frontier in what we know as Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims and the Kazakh Muslims live. So he was part of the initial military occupation of that area.
And what was pivotal in his becoming disillusioned with Mao and deciding to leave China?
There were several factors that came into play later on after having served as a soldier out there in the far northwest and being part of the military garrison system that had been set up there to help control that area. He then went back to university in Xi'an, where he wanted to be an aeronautics engineer to help build military aircraft for China. And he discovered several things. One is that he was trying to join the party, but they wouldn't let him in because of his family background. Not only was he from a merchant family in the British colony of Hong Kong, but his older brother, Sam, had gone to the U.S. after high school and gone there on scholarship, studied engineering, and then started working for the U.S. military.
Right.
So these two brothers found themselves on opposite sides of this geopolitical divide. And he also lived through Mao's Great Famine, the famine that killed 30 to 40 million Chinese. He starved. His classmates at university starved, but he survived. And he also saw Mao purge some very senior communist leaders, including top generals that he admired as a soldier. So all of these combined to make him think there's something structurally wrong with the party and with Mao's leadership, and he had to flee to Hong Kong.
Understood. Okay. Well, look, so a lot of the, I mean, aside from your family, a lot of the, because of your family, the focus of the book is on the Chinese borderlands. Now, I guess the idiot's perspective, if I may speak for myself, would be, look, China, massive, huge country. What do they care about the borderlands? There's plenty of China that isn't the borderlands. Why are the borders so important to China, both in reality, in geopolitics, but also in psyche?
Yeah, the argument that I make in the book is that these frontier regions are actually central to the Communist Party's control of China,
Right.
and the way it exercises power. And we're not talking about small places that are just along the border. We're talking about the huge swaths of territory. Xinjiang, which is 1/6 of China, Tibet, which combined with Xinjiang make up a quarter to a third of China. It's incredible, the sweep of these areas. And essentially, my argument is that China is a reconstituted empire, that the Communist Party has succeeded in reconstituting the Qing Empire that had fallen apart. So whereas all the other great Eurasian empires dissolved, like the British Empire, the French, the Russians, the Ottomans, communist China was able to reform itself. And so it exercises force in a way that very few other nation states have to do in order to hold their country together. And that changes the mindset, I think, of the communist leaders.
And among the communist leaders in Beijing itself, is this empire understood in the sense that we'd think of empire in terms of dominion, or is it understood in the sense of these people are all Chinese, we belong together, we're a family? Is there a almost like a sort of internal Chinese racism about the borderlands?
China has a very strong ethnic nationalist element, and I believe that the ethnic Han, which is the majority of interior China, believe that they are a superior culture or civilization to many of the people around them, and that there's a feeling of noblesse oblige that they're bringing civilization to other parts of China. They're bringing economic development. They're bringing culture. They're bringing a common language. And so they're imposing all of these things on many of the people in the borderlands. My father was among that project in its early years. And it feels like that they are doing this in a way that has created lots of tension and conflict in these border regions. So they do believe they have this civilizing project. They talk about everyone belonging to this nation state called China, but in reality, the way it's exercised is very much about dominion.
Right, that's fascinating. Let's talk about some specific border regions then. I mean, we hear a lot about Taiwan. Presumably, the situation there is a bit different from there because, I mean, well, tell us about how China regards Taiwan.
Sure. Taiwan is, of course, self-governing. It's not under the Communist Party rule in any way. And Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, is obsessed with China in a similar way to many other leaders before him. But I think because China has reached a certain level of development in its economic stages and its military growth, then Xi has talked more about the possibility of forceful reunification, as he calls it, with Taiwan and bringing Taiwan under the Communist Party fold. And there's two main reasons. One is that it's a piece of unfinished business from the Civil War when the nationalists fled there and set up their government. And then it's part of the Qing Empire, too. And part of the conception of Chinese empire is to hold together everything that the Qing had conquered. And so the Qing had conquered Taiwan, the Qing had conquered Tibet, Xinjiang. So that's why China feels the need, the current government feels the need to try and get all those places under its dominion.
Right, okay. And I mean, what do you see as being the near-term future of Taiwan? Do you anticipate conflict there, perhaps even world conflict over there?
Yeah, that's a question that in Washington everyone talks about these days.
Course.
It's the biggest flashpoint between the U.S. and China. The U.S. is obviously a partner with Taiwan. It believes in sustaining the democracy that's been formed there. And the U.S. is undergoing its own military buildup in the region in order to try and deter any thoughts of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I don't think Xi has stated definitively that he will invade Taiwan. I know some mid-level U.S. officials, military officials, think that he intends to do that, but I think the verdict is out on his real intentions. And much might depend on the changing circumstances in China. Right now, China's undergoing a great slowdown in its economic growth. It's at 5% or lower growth instead of double-digit growth now. And if that trajectory continues, then perhaps that might change Xi's calculus. He might decide he needs to maintain stability in his foreign policy, and so he might be less aggressive in his actions in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, for example.
And in this country, obviously, we have a particular interest in your ancestral homeland of Hong Kong. What do you see as being the future there?
Yeah, that's grim. I mean, we saw what happened in 2019. I was there to report on the protest. That forms an entire chapter in my book. And the future of Hong Kong, I think, is not a pretty one. We see the Communist Party exercising more control. They've locked up prominent journalists. They've threatened lawmakers. They're barring. They've had the government of Hong Kong bar certain people from running for office in the parliamentary system there. And many people from Hong Kong have fled. Many of the intellectuals, many of the more liberal political activists have.
We had Nathan Law on the program a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nathan's a great guy, very articulate. And since I've been here in the UK the last couple of days, I hear from British friends about a large number of Hong Kong residents have fled here to the UK. So I think the future looks very bleak for Hong Kong. I think more and more elite Chinese money will flow into Hong Kong, and they'll be the ones that are setting the terms and setting the agenda in Hong Kong.
Our Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke to Xi Jinping yesterday, I believe, and as well as being the sort of the boilerplate sort of terms, the discussion that came out of that. There was also some mention that one of the main things they discussed was, of course, Chinese support for Russia with the war with Ukraine. Tell us, China's relationship with Russia is inherently one about borderlands. How does that work? How can it be both the case that China appears as a sort of almost like a sponsor of Russia these days, and yet has all these fractious borderlands that it shares with Russia?
Yeah, it's very interesting because what you point out is something that has been a historical tension point between Russia and China. Russians themselves have always been suspicious of Asian migration into the Russian Far East, and I think they still are. We see many Chinese going to that area. But at the same time, I think that Xi feels he's ideologically aligned with Putin currently, and also for in terms of geopolitical power plays, uh, that he needs to align with Putin in order to present a united front against what they see as expansions of Western ideas, of Western efforts to promote democracy, mainly led by America, and also of America's security state overseas. So I think that he feels he has to align with Putin. And according to the Biden administration, he's giving material support to Russia to help rebuild its defense industry, although he's not giving weapons per se right now to Russia.
Yeah, sure. Look, and with your family history and particularly your father's history, what was your experience like as the Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times? Were you under sort of constant surveillance in ways that you knew and presumably didn't know about? Was it comfortable?
Yeah, it varied over time. I mean, I came into Beijing for my work posting in 2008 when it was a fairly open time, relatively speaking. They were trying to welcome journalists who were coming to cover the Olympics. And then gradually, year by year, it got more and more difficult. And by the time I left, they were threatening to revoke many of our visas, or they were blocking people from entering China on journalist visas. There was much more intense police surveillance of us when some of us went out to certain parts of the country, especially those border regions like Xinjiang. There was intense police surveillance. And then this was the most disconcerting thing. They kept questioning or interrogating sources that we talked to or Chinese reporters who worked with us. So people who are much more vulnerable in that system, Chinese citizens, were under greater threat in their day-to-day contacts with us. And so we knew that security agents were contacting them.
Did it make a difference in a bad way, or indeed, I suppose, a good way, that you were yourself of Chinese heritage?
I think overall it made a sense and it was a positive thing. I mean, first it allowed me to get into areas unnoticed. So just the very fact of being get on an airplane, go into a city or into the countryside and walk around and talk to people without being noticed by security agents, I thought was very helpful. I also thought that my interactions with Chinese officials felt more interesting because of that. Like they knew about my family background. They knew my father has served in the Chinese army, and I think that that made some of the conversations more interested. There was more of a give and take in my exchanges with them.
Fascinating. Edward Wong, thank you very much indeed.